Many believe that violent resistance to authoritarianism and dictatorships is the only way to liberate the population from these oppressive systems of government. However, this belief, pervasive as it may be, either directly contradicts or flat out ignores the number of incidents in which nonviolent protests, demonstrations, and other forms of resistance have succeeded at rates far greater than those of their violent counterparts. Not only is this approach to overthrowing a dictatorship more likely to succeed, but it will also build trust and cooperation between many different demographic groups in the state. Perhaps the greatest issue with using violent means to overthrow a dictatorship is the fact that it is incredibly difficult, if not virtually impossible, to beat the regime at its own game. In the words of the late political scientist Gene Sharp, by placing confidence in violent means, one has chosen the very type of struggle with which the oppressors nearly always have superiority. However, Sharp argues, even if an armed rebellion does succeed, specifically in the form of guerrilla warfare, not only is the resulting regime even more authoritarian than its predecessor, but it continues to leave historically oppressed groups behind in its reign. Professor Erica Chenoweth echoes Sharp's claim, stating that nonviolent protests and demonstrations are more visible to the public, which would make them more likely to attract a diverse group of participants. They also cite statistics that show how nonviolent rebellions are more than twice as likely to succeed as violent rebellions. In addition, they point out how the success of nonviolent resistance has increased noticeably over the past several years, while that of violent resistance has seen a sharp drop. These results surprised them because they went into this analysis believing that some violence was inevitably going to be needed to fight a dictatorial regime.
Well, back then I bought into the idea that power flows from the barrel of a gun. And what I would have said was that although it was tragic, it was logical in such situations for people to use violence to seek their change. They brought up cases like Serbia, where a nonviolent revolution toppled Slobodan Milosevic, the butcher of the Balkans, in October of 2000, and the Philippines, where the People Power movement ousted Ferdinand Marcos in 1986. At the workshop, I said stuff like, well, those were probably exceptions. For every successful case you guys bring up, I can think of a failed case like Tiananmen Square. I figured that if they were right and I was wrong, somebody better find out. So for the next 2 years, I collected data on all major nonviolent and violent campaigns for the overthrow of a government or territorial liberation since 1900. The data cover the entire world and consist of every known case where there were at least 1,000 observed participants. This is hundreds of cases. Then I analyzed the data, and the results blew me away.
Several examples of nonviolent resistance are given both by Sharp and Chenoweth, including demonstrations such as protests and vigils, and economic and social non-cooperation, mainly strikes and boycotts. However, one of the most challenging, yet arguably the most important methods of resistance is recruiting potential citizens of differing identities and backgrounds to your side. Given how authoritarian leaders like to hype up the cultural and ethnic differences between citizens to turn them against each other, they are deflecting anger towards themselves, knowing the potential for them to become the common enemy of the people. Perhaps one of the best examples of this division occurred on April 6, 1994 in Rwanda, when the president, a Hutu, was killed in a plane crash. Immediately, the Hutu-led government blamed the Rwandan Patriotic Front, a rebel group led by the Tutsi. However, numerous human rights groups, including Human Rights Watch Africa, disputed this notion and stated their beliefs that it was actually Hutu extremists that were responsible for the crash in order to create tension between the two ethnic groups. Regardless, from the day of the president's death onward, every Tutsi was subject to accusations of working with the Rwandan Patriotic Front. These ethnic tensions were nothing new, according to investigative journalist Raymond, who states that, quote, politicians have repeatedly tried to foster ethnic loyalty and ethnic fears, in the case of the Hutu, to keep control of the government, in the case of the Tutsi, to marshal support for the rebel front. Despite these divisions based on ethnic and religious lines, convincing the people of their common enemy is vital in working towards overthrowing a dictatorship, as it is a step towards recruiting them for participation in the resistance against such a regime. Through nonviolent and civil disobedience, as well as participation in protests and demonstrations and non-cooperation, the movement to overthrow the authoritarian regime of a state will gain traction and move new people to join the side of the rebellion. Strength in numbers is the most impactful way to bring about tangible, long-lasting change.